Hey all, welcome back to the lab. In this video, we're going to be talking about a simple TypeScript and Node template for interviews. It includes an async main function, web API, and tests. So let's get into it. So I've been interviewing for remote software engineer roles for the past several weeks, and one interview type has proven more clunky than others, the quote-unquote real-world interview. Now, typically the company wants you to build a program in your own environment with your own tools to see how you use real-world tools to interact with things like files and APIs. Now, on the surface, this makes a lot of sense, but if you're not prepared for it, you can easily lose a good 15 minutes of your 45-minute interview just trying to get your basic project set up. As an example, like when's the last time you built a project from nothing? No package.json, no requirements.txt, just you and the command line. Now, I got burned by this a few times as I fiddled with getting TypeScript transpilation working or setting up an express service so that I could build endpoints, so I decided to do something about that. Now, in this post, we'll walk through a template that I built to make it easy to come into a real-world interview, ready to focus on the problem and to not fiddle with any setup. Now, we will be going through a lot of source code here, as I usually do in my demos, but as always, Dominions members do get access to all the project files on GitHub, so you can git clone and start running it, as well as dozens of other example projects that we talk about here on the blog. You also support me making more posts like this, so thank you if you already are one. Okay, so let's start off with what this template actually is. So in most of these real-world interviews, you get about 45 minutes to get a working solution for whatever the problem is, and they often fall into one or more of these buckets. So the first one is build a web API that does X. So this might be some CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete endpoints. Or it might be something like builds a simple get endpoint, but then build a rate limiter on it, and that's kind of where the problem focuses. But in either way, they have a little bit of overhead in terms of setting up an actual web server so they can hit or receive HTTP requests. Another category of these are integrating with an existing API to do something with that data. So an example that I ran into is like getting train schedules from a public API, and then you have to, do operations on them and then return that to an endpoint, or at least print it out to standard out. Or some companies actually give you like a custom mock API that gets you, custom data from there. So you just have to, fetch and get the data and maybe post it back to another API. And then the third category are reading files, doing some operations on that stuff, and then sometimes writing the outputs to another file. And so an example of this might be analyzing customer data that might give to you in JSON or CSV, and then you do some operations on that stuff, and then whatever the output is, you might need to write it to like a local JSON file. And in some cases, this is going to be a combination of some. Like in one case I had, you hit an API to get some data, you do some data munging on it, and then you post this back to another API, which returns a PNG image, and then you have to write that to a file, and then you check it that way. But these are the three general buckets of real-world interviews that I've seen in this cycle, and that, this template is trying to make easier, or at least, get some of the piping overhead out of the way. And so the problems themselves are usually about like leak code easy to medium, because these aren't really testing like your algorithm skills, it's really testing your like end-to-end skills. But the added overhead of piping these inputs and outputs from and to various formats can trip you up if you haven't been practicing that. And so the goal of this template is to really provide a simple scalable system for providing common tools to handle this overhead so that you can focus on the logic and solve the leak code easy medium that, you've been training for without getting stumbling on the overhead, because you really only have a short amount of time to show your skills. And so the main things that this template is trying to cover is one, transpiling and running TypeScript. I really like types. I really don't like writing JavaScript by itself, especially in an interview setting. Types help me a lot. So I don't want to mess with, my package.json or whatever. An async main function, which seems dumb, but if you're used to running an async and you've never set this up before, this can easily lose you a few minutes. An express web server for building simple endpoints. Yes, not all of these real worlds need endpoints, but when you do, you don't want to mess with like trying to set up express. Some helper methods for reading and writing files and get post requests to endpoints. And then just some jest tests so you can write or run tests. Most interviews don't really require you to write tests in this way. They're fine with like you just running tests manually in like the main function. But I found that if you, have an issue and you're trying to debug it or make sure that you have, a case set up, just having the test there can be a really easy way to do this debugging fast. And so in some cases, this can be really helpful. So this covers all of the overhead cases that I've had to face in these kinds of interviews over the past few weeks, and is what I bring to these kinds of interviews today when I'm using TypeScript. Now I do want to caveat that like not all codes or companies are cool with you bringing your own code, but usually the ones that are not cool with you bringing a template or base repo with you will provide their own form of a base code template. And so in those cases, you usually will end up in basically the same boat of having at least some framework to start from. Okay, so this is how you run the boilerplate. Obviously install your dependencies with npm install, and then we have a test and a run function, and I'll demo this here. Okay, and so here we are in my HAMY Labs code examples repo, and we can see that I'm in the Node TypeScript interview boilerplate, and we'll cancel this and run npm install, which will install, and then we'll do npm run test to test, and we can see that, just runs, got a few basic tests here, it passes. Obviously this like async operation thing isn't great, but this is a little boilerplate for an interview, and you're not going to get points off for this. And then we'll do run start, and we'll dive into the code and like why it looks like this in the next section, but mainly just wanted to show that we show which port we're listening to for the Express server, and then I'm also printing out some items here with my example domain just to kind of prove that this works and give you an idea of like how you might use this in a real interview, as well as a little bit of sanity checking that like when I actually run this from a git clone, that everything's installed and it's actually running, versus actually finding that out a few minutes into the interview and it's like, oh no, I'm missing a dependency or something. And so these are the outputs from that example business logic that I have, and then it says it's listening on port 5000. So let me prove that. So here I am, localhost 5000, and all it's doing is just returning a raw string. I'm an endpoint, and so that's what you see here. And so obviously in an interview, you'd probably change this around and take in whatever parameters and output whatever, but this at least gives you an endpoint you can start working from. Okay, so that is how we run it, and now we're going to go into a code walkthrough. So all of the code that we'll be going over is here. This is basically all the files and code that are meaningful in the repo. And then I have all the code just printed out here, but we will be going over this in my editor just so you can get some syntax highlighting. Okay, so here's the README with all of the commands that you might use for this. And then we'll start off in the package.json to kind of show you what it is. It's very simple. The main ones are just start and test. And I made start actually do the compilation and then actually run it because, this is an interview and make it as simple as possible. And then test is just running jest, which will run all of the tests here. And we have really minimal dependencies, basically just, the bare things that we need to actually run all of our little functions. Index.ts is going to be the root of our directory or the root of our app. And so first we have a main function here because a lot of interviews, especially the ones that are like reading and writing files, like they don't necessarily need a web server. They just want you to like run it and show that you can read, write files. And so this is great for those kinds of interviews, or even, hitting APIs that are external. So we have an async main function here, and this is where we are logging to console here just so you can see that this thing is actually working and has all dependencies. And we're calling into the example business logic here, again, just to give you an idea of how you might use this if you choose to like write this stuff in another file. And then at the bottom is where we're actually creating our Express app. This is where we're setting it should go to port 5000, and this is where we are creating our endpoint at root, and this is how we're spinning it up. Again, not every interview actually needs endpoints, but if you do, you really don't want to waste precious minutes trying to configure Express apps. So hopefully this gives a pretty easy way to set up new endpoints or do something different with the existing endpoint. Okay, next let's look at the little example logic I have. Basically these things are get user to do, which is calling into this JSON placeholder API to just get like mock data back, which is going to be very similar to what you're doing in one of those API interviews. So this is get using my fetch data utility, and then this is post with the post data utility, and just kind of showing you how you can do this in a type safe manner. Hitting this, making it cast to the type that we have above, and then returning it all async. Next, let's look at these fetch utils, and these really are geared towards JSON because that's just the most common thing that you'll be getting and posting in interviews like this. And really it's just a glorified wrapper around fetch. And so a lot of people, especially if you're really comfortable with fetch, like this will be overkill. This might even get in the way and feel too clunky for you. But personally, I don't usually use fetch in my TypeScript, and honestly, usually I'm using F#. And so having this in place for me to actually see what's going on and a template to work off of helps me a lot. So you take an URL, any headers that you might need, useful if you need to authenticate with something or something like that. You actually do your get fetch here. It throws if the response is not okay. And then basically it's getting the JSON out here and casting it to T. Post data is very similar. Giving a URL, you're getting your data of type T, setting your headers to do JSON, you're posting the stringified version of that data, checking if it's okay or not, and then getting the response out, casting it to R if you provide it, and then returning the response data. So maybe not like fully production ready code, but it is a nice wrapper handling the 90% case. The next one we have is our file utilities for reading and writing files. Pretty straightforward. Give it a file path. It's going to read the file and return, or catch and print to console. Same with writing for a file here. Give it the file path and content, and it'll do that. Then finally, we have our jest file, which is mad at me right now. Although I don't think it should be mad at me. Let me reload this. Okay, nice. So reload. Oh, no, it didn't. Okay, we got type, so that seems to help. But anyway, this is our little jest file. This, main function testing is a little overkill, so honestly might want to even delete this. But we do have like testing the read-write files, and really just to give you an example of like how to run this stuff. So in the event that you do want to run tests in an interview, you can. Usually interviews don't ask you to write tests. They'll just have you like run the code and prove it works through the main function. But I do find in some cases, especially the ones where they give you a prompt and kind of leave you for 2 hours, that in those 2 hours you might find you want to debug a certain part of your code, and these tests obviously come in handy for that. So just having the boilerplate so you don't have to like worry about configuring jest or whatever, I find has helped me in the past. Yep, so again, all of the code and stuff is here in the blog post. If you just want to read through it, copy paste it, use it as you want, that's fine. And so yeah, that's the little TypeScript and Node template that I've been using in interviews. And it's definitely not production ready, but it is simple enough that most interviewers seem to be okay with it. Versus I think if you came in with like a full-on like boilerplate, they'd be like, what is this madness? We're literally writing like a little program. And it's covered a lot of the common overhead operations that I've found, so I can focus on the logic itself and not worry about like trying to read or write a file or something like that that isn't really testing anything. It's just seeing if I can remember or search up this API easily. So as a reminder, Hymenians members do get full access to the project files on GitHub, and so if you want to just git clone and run this project, join there, and then you can find all the files here at this link. Now, if you like this post, you might also like why type-safe programming languages are better than dynamic ones and lead to faster, safer software at scale. And honestly, one of the big, reasons why I choose type-safe languages, even in interviews when, quote-unquote dynamic might be faster, I still find types to be very, very helpful in these faster environments as well. You might also be interested in the HAM stack, a simple scalable tech stack for building modern web apps fast and cheap, a little bit more about my philosophy for building web apps these days. And then if you are interested in seeing how I am currently building a lot of my production-ready apps, you might be interested in spin up a full-stack F# web app in 10 minutes with the Cloud Seed project template. If you're curious why I don't use F# for interviews, it's usually because that's not provided, and it's going to confuse a lot of people, which often is not that helpful in interviews. And even if you do well in a like quote-unquote esoteric language, or a language that's very niche, sometimes they'll actually count this against you. And so far I have strayed away from using F# in most interviews and just stick to like a TypeScript or a Python. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.